Alright, in this video we're going to solve a few trig equations like this one. So this looks pretty straightforward. Let's just get tangent x by itself. So we will subtract 1 from both sides. That gives us the cube root tangent x is equal to -1. To get tangent by itself, we will divide both sides by radical 3 here. So those cancel out. And now we have tangent x equals -1 over radical 3. So the question is, what angle, if you take the tangent of what angle, will you get -1 over radical 3? Focus on the 1 over radical 3 part. Now, here's a chart of information that you simply need to memorize. So notice that here we have the tangent of theta equaling 1 over radical 3, and that is pi over 6. So the tangent of pi over 6 is 1 over radical 3. Got to memorize that. Okay, so that tells us the reference angle. That's not necessarily the answer, but it gives us the reference angle. So since the reference angle is going to be pi over 6, I like to draw some pi over 6's. So the top half here is pi. So I'm going to divide that into 6 parts, and then each part will be 1/6 pi, or pi over 6. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So each one of these is pi over 6. Now in terms of reference angle, these are the 4 angles that have a reference angle of pi over 6, because each of these is pi over 6 away from the horizontal axis. So each one of these 4 angles will have a tangent of 1 over radical 3, except 2 of them will be and in the third quadrant, and tangent is negative in the second quadrant and in the fourth quadrant. So if I want a -1 over radical 3, it's going to be one of these 2 angles right here. So we're talking about this angle and this angle. So what are they? So here I have 1 pi over 6, 2 pi over 6, 3 pi over 6, 4 pi over 6, 5 pi over 6. So this is 5 pi over 6. 6 pi over 6, 7 pi over 6, 8 pi over 6, 9 pi over 6, 10 pi over 6, 11 pi over 6. So there you go. X is equal to 5 pi over 6 or 11 pi over 6. Alright, let's do a couple more. See what else we have. Alright, well we only have one function, which always makes it easier. Let's get it by itself. Subtracting 8 from both sides. So far that gives me 4 secant x is equal to -8. Dividing both sides of the equation by 4, that's going to give me secant x is equal to -2. Now, secant is the reciprocal of the cosine function. Alright, these are reciprocals of each other. So if I take the reciprocal of both sides of the equation, the reciprocal of secant is cosine. So if I do the reciprocal over here, I'm going to get the cosine. If I do the reciprocal of this, I'm going to get -1/2. So now I've done the reciprocal of both sides. So now it's time to answer the question. Cosine of what angle is equal to -1/2? Forget the negative for a second and look back at the information that you should have memorized. So if you haven't memorized this, pause the tape and go memorize this. So see the 1/2, the cosine of pi over 3 is 1/2, alright? This should be memorized. So that tells me that the reference angle is pi over 3. That doesn't mean the answer is pi over 3, that's just the reference angle. But that tells me how to draw my picture. If the reference angle is pi over 3, then guess what? I'm going to draw a bunch of pi over 3's. Alright, considering that the top half of the circle is pi, that's why I divided this into 3 equal parts. So each one is 1/3 of pi. Each one is pi over 3. So that means that these are the 4 angles that have a reference angle of pi over 3. That means the cosine of any one of these angles is going to give me some kind of 1/2. But 2 of them will be positive and 2 of them will be negative. So when you're talking about cosine, on the unit circle, cosine is the x value. Okay, this is the cosine, is always the x value. So where are x values positive and where are they negative? Well, if this is the x-axis, you know that the positive values are to the right and the negative values are to the left. So that's why these 2 angles over here are going to have a positive cosine because they're to the right hand side, and these 2 angles over here will have a negative cosine because they are to the left. So in this case we want a negative 1/2, so I want to use these 2 angles. Will give me the answers. Alright, so I'm talking about this angle and this angle. The cosine of either one of these will be negative 1/2. So let's see. So this is 1 pi over 3, 2 pi over 3, 3 pi over 3, 4 pi over 3. Okay, so x is equal to 2 pi over 3 or 4 pi over 3. Alright, let's do one more on this video. Okay, cotangent. So let's add radical 3 to both sides. So that'll give me cotangent x is equal to radical 3. Now, of course, cotangent is the reciprocal of tangent. So if I do the reciprocal of both sides, so the reciprocal of cotangent is tangent. So if I do the reciprocal of the left, that's going to turn this into tangent. If I do the reciprocal of this, that'll just be 1 over radical 3. So the question is, tangent of what angle is 1 over radical 3? Let's look back at the chart of stuff we're supposed to memorize. Here's 1 over radical 3. The tangent of pi over 6 is 1 over radical 3. So that means pi over 6 is the reference angle. It's not necessarily the answer, but it is the reference angle. So if pi over 6 is the reference angle, then I should draw a bunch of pi over 6's. Okay, the top half of the circle is pi. So I'm going to take that top half of the circle and divide it into 6 parts. And each one of them will be 1/6 pi, or pi over 6. Alright, now I'm not doing a great job of splitting these up. Look how crooked that is. Laugh at me if you want, but my answers will be correct. Okay, so I'm not an artist, as you can tell, but schematically you can see that I've divided this pi up into 6 parts up here. So now the angles that have a reference angle of pi over 6 are these 4 angles, here, 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 and here, because each of these are pi over 6 away from the horizontal. That means the tangent of any of these 4 will give me some kind of 1 over radical 3. It's just that 2 of them will be positive and 2 of them will be negative. Now it is worth memorizing that tangent is positive in the first quadrant and in the third quadrant, and tangent is negative in the second quadrant and the fourth quadrant. So if I want a positive 1 over radical 3, then my solutions will be here and here. So that first one is just plain old pi over 6, 1 pi over 6. Now I'm going to count my way around. This is 1 pi over 6, 2 pi over 6, 3 pi over 6, 4 pi over 6, 5 pi over 6, 6 pi over 6, 7 pi over 6. So these are the two solutions. Oh, you know what? I really wanted to use the pink. So x is equal to pi over 6 or 7 pi over 6. All right, these problems have been so quick and easy that I'm going to go ahead and do 2 more problems on this video. So, okay, getting cosine by itself, I'm going to add 9 radical 3 to both sides. So that's going to give me 18 cosine x is equal to 9 radical 3. Now it is time to divide both sides by 18. Alright, 9 goes into 18 twice, so that's going to be radical 3 over 2. Cancel those out. So that's as far as we go here. So the question is, cosine of what angle is radical 3 over 2? Alright, now here's a chart of things that you must memorize. So let's pretend that we are looking inside your brain, and this is what we see. So the cosine of what angle is radical 3 over 2? So here's cosine, and here's radical 3 over 2. So that is pi over 6. Cosine of pi over 6 is radical 3 over 2. That doesn't mean radical 3 over 2 is the answer. It means that, I'm sorry, did I say radical 3 over 2? I meant to say that does not mean that pi over 6 is the answer. It means that pi over 6 is the reference angle. So, if pi over 6 is the reference angle, then what I like to do is draw a bunch of pi over 6s. Okay, now if you've been watching this whole video, you've already seen me do this 2 other times. So I know I'm talking to you as though I'm doing it for the first time, just in case somebody jumped straight to this problem. So anyway, I have a pi over 6s. I have 6 little pieces in the top half. Now, the 4 angles that have a reference angle of pi over 6 are going to be the 4 angles surrounding the horizontal axis, above, below, above, below. So any of these angles will have a cosine of radical 3 over 2, except 2 of them will be positive and 2 of them will be negative. For cosine, remember that on the unit circle, every point on the unit circle is in the form cosine, comma, sine. Alright, so cosine is an x value on the unit circle. So where is x positive and where is x negative? So on the coordinate plane, if you look at the x-axis, we know that this is the positive side of the x-axis and this is the negative side. So x's are positive to the right, negative to the left. So that means cosine will be positive here because this is where x's are positive, and it will be negative here because this is where x's are negative. Now for this particular problem, we want a positive answer. Alright, because cosine x equals positive radical 3 over 2. So that means these 2 angles will be the solutions, the 2 positive ones. So remember, this is pi over 6 right here. So this first one is just plain old pi over 6. Now what about this one down here? Well, if I count my way around the long way, I would go 1 pi over 6, 2 pi over 6, 3 pi over 6, 4 pi over 6, 5 pi over 6, 6 pi over 6, 7 pi over 6, 8 pi over 6, 9 pi over 6, 10 pi over 6, 11 pi over 6. Now, when you get more comfortable with this, you'll start to take shortcuts, like thinking to yourself, Well, you know, all the way around the circle is 2 pi. That's the same thing as 12 pi over 6, all right? So if this is 12 pi over 6, 1 less would be 11 pi over 6. Anyways, these are the answers. So x is equal to pi over 6 or 11 pi over 6. Okay. Okay, this will be the last one on this video. Getting that cosine by itself once again, I'm going to add 4 radical 2 to both sides. So that'll give me 8 cosine x is equal to 4 radical 2. Okay, so dividing both sides by 8, I will have cosine x. 4 goes into 8 twice, so this is going to be radical 2 over 2. So that's the end of the line here. It's time to think about the answers. Cosine of what angle is radical 2 over 2? So let's look at the things that you're supposed to memorize. Here's the chart of memorization. All this should be in your brain. So here's cosine, here's radical 2 over 2. Cosine of pi over 4 is radical 2 over 2. You just memorize this chart. Okay, that means pi over 4 is the reference angle. It's not necessarily the answer, but it tells me how to draw my picture. So in my picture, I'm going to draw a bunch of pi over 4s. Okay, so far the top is pi. I've divided up into 2 pieces, so that's pi over 2. So if I split it again, then I will have pi over 4. Alright, just right down the middle. Whoa. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces. Each one of these is pi over 4. That means, alright, these are the 4 angles that have a reference angle of pi over 4, right? Because each one of these is pi over 4 away from the horizontal. That means the cosine of any one of these 4 angles is going to be radical 2 over 2, except 2 of them will be positive and 2 of them will be negative. Now on the unit circle, cosine is always the x value. So the question is, where are x values positive and where are they negative? Well, if you look at the x-axis, we know the positive side is on the right, the negative side is on the left. Alright, that means these 2 on the right will be positive, these 2 on the left will be negative. In this case, we want positive. We want the cosine to be positive radical 2 over 2. So we're going to be looking to these angles for the answers. So this is simply pi over 4, as we planned. What about this one? Well, this is 1 pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, 4 pi over 4, 5 pi over 4, 6 pi over 4, 7 pi over 4. Okay, sometimes I think backwards and I go, okay, all the way around, 2 pi is the same as 8 pi over 4, so back 1 would be 7 pi over 4. Anyway, so the answers are pi over 4 and 7 pi over 4. Alright, that's going to do it for this video. More to come. Stay tuned.